Data does not speak for itself. There's a set of numbers. They may, but what do they mean? They mean absolutely zero. They're just squiggles on a spreadsheet. You have to construct, in a way, a narrative that's just true to the evidence. Oh, if we had enough data, it'd suddenly tell us what to do, or it'd tell us what happened or why it happened. Yeah, it's nonsense, and everyone knows it's nonsense.
You feel that Messrs. Witty and Vallance and Van-Tam had a pretty good pandemic in their communication?
Yeah, I think it wasn't bad at all, but they were hindered slightly by so much of the presentations being generated from number 10. We don't want to be saying, oh, isn't this an awful thing? We should be doing X. No. You don't immediately draw some consequence rule, because that's what really pisses me off.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, the Emeritus Professor of Statistics at the University of Cambridge. David has been one of the most important figures in statistics and one of the best data storytellers for the past 40 plus years. He was Winston Professor for the Public Understanding of Risks from 2007 and Chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge from 2016. David was knighted 2 years earlier for his services to statistics. Throughout his career, it's fair to say that David has been a passionate advocate of clear, straightforward and meaningful communication of data. He's gone out of his way to enable those not trained in statistics to understand and use data in their day-to-day decision-making, and his bacon sandwich explanation of relative and absolute risk is the stuff of legend. In 2001, he worked with the writer and broadcaster Michael Blastland to create the long-running BBC Radio 4 series about numbers in the news, more or less, with whom he also wrote the book The Norm Chronicles about Risk. David's other popular science bestsellers include 2015's Sex by Numbers and 2019's The Art of Statistics. And although it can't be said that many people in the public eye had a, quotes, good pandemic, I would say David most certainly did. He appeared very regularly in print and broadcast media to bring some data-driven common sense to the often highly charged and politicised debates about lockdowns, school and workplace shutdowns, and the risk of both COVID and vaccinations. I'd say he's a constant thorn in the side of the Johnson and Cummings spin machine at the heart of UK government, speaking often uncomfortable truths unto power. And once COVID was in retreat, David distilled his wisdom on the statistics of the pandemic into his 2021 book, COVID by Numbers. Away from statistics, David is the first and only world champion in Loop, a version of pool invented by the mathematician Alex Bellos, and played on an elliptical table with just one pocket. We may come back to this. And he describes his proudest achievement ever as when, in 2011, he did moderately well in the first and only series of Winter Wipeout on BBC One, in the guise of Professor Risk. David, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Yeah, great pleasure to be here.
Now, I trust that that's a decent summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
Oh no, that sounds pretty good. I wasn't in at the beginning of More or Less, although I know Michael Blastland for a long time, and I've appeared a lot in that program. I sort of feel a friend and supporter of it, but I wasn't involved in actually developing it. But it is extraordinary that a program on statistics, which must have seemed a really bizarre idea to have the radio, has been extraordinarily successful. They really do have a large number of loyal listeners, and it's always a pleasure working with them.
Very good. Now, before we get down and dirty with data, I wanted to ask a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your work. So could you tell me, David, how do you spend your time?
Oh dear. Well, working I've been retired 5 years, so I don't get paid anymore essentially, but I still, it's the only thing I can do. It's what I do, and I like working on stats and data and stories and trying to, make things clear to people, trying to raise the level of discussion of the sort of things I'm interested in. That's basically what I try to do. So I do quite a lot of that. I try to find time for other things. I like traveling, and I try to be very active, and whether it's walking or even a little bit of running with the dog. And I go on holidays. I just come back from a month in India, but even then I was working most of the time. Always had my laptop with me, and always settle down and do some writing and keeping up with emails and things like that. So that's what I do. I like spending time with family, but it is nice not having a job, because you can just pick and choose what you spend your time on. And I pick and choose to spend my time on communicating stats and ideas behind it, but I don't have to do all the drudge, refereeing papers and submitting grants, all that. So, I've had a career doing all that rubbish, and it's great not having to do any of that.
Very good. Now, we met in late 2018 at a workshop that you were running with Winton Centre colleagues that was called Communicating Uncertainty in Scientific and Economic Research. And I have to say, that really was a busman's holiday for data storytellers, data visualizers. It was a hugely enjoyable couple of days out in the Buckinghamshire countryside. Can you tell me what's motivated you to drive public understanding of statistics, and particularly evidence and risk and uncertainty around risk throughout your career?
Yeah, I suppose I started off really approaching this from a mathematical perspective. I did do maths, and I got interested in probability and statistics and started working in that. But I've always been, and I always have an interest in the abstract methodology. You can get me going on the meaning of probability and Bayesian statistics, and I'll just wind me up and off I'll go for hours. And I wrote papers and big highly cited technical papers and all this kind of stuff. So I've done all that. But I suppose I've always, even right at the beginning when I was doing that, so like to try to explain it to people. And when scientists have been talking to me about, how do I start doing what kind of thing that you ended up doing? I say, well, first of all, just practice giving good talks. Just, every academic talk is a performance, and think of it like that, and train for it like that, and look at what other people do. If you're interested in communication, then communicate. Even if it's only to your colleagues, try to do it as well as possible. As we'll get onto, the storytelling, how do you construct a narrative around the argument that you're trying to make? And, using words and using images in particular, using maths sometimes, to what extent does that help or hinder? These are really important issues. And I found myself getting just very interested in that, in a sense, performative aspect of the whole subject. And so when I got a chance to move into a job that was a communication job, a public understanding of risk job, one of these nice jobs that get philanthropically funded. We're very lucky in the UK that we've got a whole series of professors for public understanding of science and philosophy and risk and psychology and all these great jobs that have been funded for people like me who kind of got a bit fed up with doing the research bit and would like to perform. And I do feel strongly about it. Again, like wind me up and off I go about the importance of statistics in life and the numbers and data and uncertainty. And like I think many of my colleagues, our main motivation is anger. We just get so angry, or genuinely emotionally angry at people misusing, making wrong claims on the basis of numbers, misusing evidence, overclaiming their confidence in something based on shabby evidence. And I would get genuine, this is a real emotional feeling of I'm so angry, I cannot deal with this. I get so angry. So you have to be very careful on social media not to immediately start abusing people and things. So I have learned to sort of hold back a bit. But in an age of misinformation, everything more and more, a lot of it is based on data and misusing numbers. Some of it isn't. Some of it's just based on fake pictures, and just claims about what happened. But a lot of it is there's a lot of data misinformation around, and not always is misinformation. Quite often unconscious, people just looking at something and drawing the wrong conclusion and making some grand claim. And so I do think it's important in modern life, and it's kind of think was the only thing I can do. It's what I do know a bit about is the limitations of what evidence can say, what you can say on the basis of evidence. And that's really what I and other statisticians and everything, that's our expertise.
In the introduction to your book, The Art of Statistics, you quote Nate Silver from his book, The Signal of the Noise. You say the numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them, and we imbue them with meaning, which I think is such an important kind of quote that it was obviously worth repeating. Tell us why you chose it and why and how that dovetails into what you do.
I use that in every one of my talks as well. So it's, the numbers don't speak for themselves. We imbue them with meaning. I think it's absolutely right. Data does not speak for itself. There's a set of numbers. They may, but what do they mean? They mean absolutely zero. They're just squiggles on a spreadsheet. If unless you know about how they're collected, what they represent, what the limitations are, and what we can learn from them. So that's the crucial thing. People had this bizarre idea that which I think is gone completely now, that, if we had enough data, it'd suddenly tell us what to do, or it'd tell us what happened or why it happened. That's nonsense. And everyone knows it's nonsense. That you have to bring in judgment and understanding and knowledge. And story, we'll get onto it again, I know, about you have to construct, in a way, a narrative that's just true to the evidence, but doesn't overstate what the evidence says. But it always requires judgment. There's always now, in some circumstances, everyone will tend to agree on that judgment, of what's going on. Lottery balls bouncing around, unless you're really bonkers, you will as long as you know that the right numbers have gone in, you can say something about what the chances of events are, and that's it. But even then, you want to be able to check it, and very rarely will there be any area where there isn't an element of judgment coming into an appraisal of the uncertainties and the risks, or what might happen. So that's great, because that means that we all have a responsibility to bring our own judgment and understanding to a particular problem. I've just finishing off this book on uncertainty, and my crucial thing about uncertainties, it's a relationship. It has to have a subject. Someone has to be uncertain about something. It's got a subject and an object. Then, of course, it's got things like, how do you express it? Do you put it into numbers? Why are you uncertain? A source, a context, and all that kind of stuff as well. But the crucial thing is that it's a relationship. It has to have a subject and an object. So the uncertainties will vary according to who it is who's saying this uncertainty. So once you've got that understanding, I think it does change one's perspective, because it means that there's a huge responsibility on behalf of the person who is making the claims to acknowledge just how much of them has gone into that.
I was originally a classicist, and when I'm advising companies on how to conduct and analyze and present research findings, I routinely introduce them to the Socratic paradox. As I know you'll know, many times in Plato's dialogues, Socrates begins his search for the essential essence of truth or beauty or justice or courage with a line, "All that I know is that I know nothing." Do you think it's important that we embrace, as I might put it, our inner Socrates when it comes to what we do and what we don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, uncertainties is a nice definition. It's a consciousness of ignorance, and I really like that. It's very difficult. I mean, this is something you have to practice of being ignorant. I always wanted to be. If I was rich, I'd a professor of ignorance. I think would be a great title to be something like that. No, ignorance it's called agnotology, is sometimes called. But I think it's a really important issue, because we're just ignorant, and whether, as I say, I talk about it in my book, whether in fact what happens is all, actually predetermined, it's all just mechanical universe, it's all the will of God, all this. Poof, I don't care. I don't even bother to argue about these issues. Couldn't care less, because the crucial thing is our personal ignorance about what's going to happen or what's going on, and trying to resolve that. So it's all to do with our personal relationship with the outside world and each other, and trying to be honest and trustworthy about our assessment of what's going on. And that means, first of all, I use the word humility a lot in now what I'm writing, because it's that humility to admit you don't know. And yet, just because you don't know everything doesn't mean you don't know anything. You also have to have the confidence to say what you do know. So, there's this nice sort of slightly paradoxical phrases we use. You've got to be confidently uncertain. So, proclaim your uncertainty and not back off it at all.
And not bring those biases and assumptions and prior knowledge and prejudices to the line of inquiry.
Well, you always bring prior knowledge, that's true, but one can, and absolutely right. And you can never be objective at all. No, we all bring our own feelings to whatever we do. It's reflexivity is the thing. We should try at least to be aware of what we're bringing in and acknowledge what this is. are judgments. There's judgment involved, and try to ensure that those judgments are shared by many people. In other words, it's not just you going out on a limb and I think this way. Point is, you can still say that. It's absolutely fine. Why anyone should take any notice of you? Who knows? So if you want to be actually both true to yourself, but also actually kind of have someone take any notice of you, deserve attention, then what you say, should be grounded on a basis of argument, of good argument that many people agree with. So it's always best, of course, if you have a view that you can justify and that other people are signed up to. So you're not just a lone voice in the universe, because I'm deeply suspicious of those. But there's still judgment there. There's still it's not self-evident. Almost nothing is self-evident in this area.
Now, I mentioned that you were much in demand in the COVID years, and indeed you said to me a couple of years ago that you were a bit all podcasted out. So I'm delighted that you're slightly less podcasted out now. But I described you as having had a good pandemic. What do you think that we've learned from the pandemic about how best and indeed how worst to present data to the general public?
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I suppose I did have a good pandemic because I didn't get very ill, and I actually had something to do, even though I was stuck at home. I was sitting, turned the sort of front room into a mini studio, and performed and did a lot of work. I mean, the point is, data was coming in every day at 4 o'clock from the dashboard. Other data coming in every week, and I was doing the analyses. The ONS data used to come in 9:30 on Tuesday morning. Well, I think we were doing press briefings by 11 o'clock. So, that was the most incredibly intense time of doing all the analyses and getting the graphs done and things like that, and being ready to do briefings at the Science Media Centre from the data. So it's really quite exciting, since it's nice to have something to do. So we were busy, we were writing. We had Anthony Masters and I had a column in the Observer for 50 weeks. They gave us 350 words in the bottom of the middle of the paper on statistics, and we did one or two and thought, well, that's it, that's fine. And they said, well, carry on. We said, we'll do a few more. Can we stop now? No, people like it. 50 of them we did, until we said, we're going to stop. We refused to do any more, and then they gave us a whole page. So that was a real challenge, really, against storytelling. 350 words, God, twice as difficult as 700 words in it, and without jargon, without maths, without graphs, and yet telling really quite subtle statistical stories about everything. And this stuff was popular. People were interested, and it felt quite a worthwhile thing to do. And we'll get on to this, but one had to, particularly in where you did have a lot of polarized points of view, trying not to be polarized, sort of sitting in the middle. But what have we learned? Oh God, about communication. Yeah, that done properly, there is a huge audience and market for communicating about stats, when people are genuinely interested in it, that people are capable of understanding really quite subtle things in terms of graphs and numbers and concepts, and want to hear more. They just genuinely want to hear it. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. That the crucial thing is being trustworthy, and people can spot it when you're not, and that we can talk about what that means later on, but I feel that very strongly indeed. And essentially how not to do it, which is to try to manipulate people's emotions, either to frighten them deliberately or reassure them, as so many people were doing, including the government. I think some of the government, maybe not statistics, but in terms of they had deliberately fear-generating advertising, which I think is a total disgrace, and I think counterproductive, but really disgraceful. So, and I think the government also, in a way, I think I'm really conscious this, had a policy of actually deliberately not talking about some aspects of the pandemic, and in terms of the risks, and so, which annoyed me right from the beginning, which I tried my best, but didn't really succeed. Yeah. So I think it can be done. You get Jonathan Van-Tam or Chris Witty or people like that. They can talk about really quite subtle stuff because they're trusted and they're trustworthy and they understand difficult issues and they can do it. So I really like you treat the audience with respect. Don't the usual thing. Treat them as if they're intelligent, but they don't know anything. And that's the approach to take.
You remind me when you talk about those scaremongering ads about a campaign that was run by the Austrian government in the I think it was the late 70s, maybe early 80s, when they were considering introducing a speed limit on motorways, autobahns for the first time, and they split the country in half rather awkwardly, north south. I mean, that leaves a little thin strip here and a little thin strip there. And I remember reading a paper 20, 30 years ago called the Megaphone Solution that was basically saying in the north of the country, they said you can drive 70 kilometers an hour. And everyone said this is absolutely ridiculous. So they drove 120. And in the south of the country, they said you can drive 100 kilometers an hour. And people drove about 105 because it felt that this wasn't such a ridiculous thing to do, and that kind of scaremongering advertising will linger long. So you think that? I mean, I think it's clear that most of the cabinet did a pretty poor job at the 5 p.m. press conferences with their handling of data. You feel that Messrs. Witty and Vallance and Van-Tam had a pretty good pandemic in their communication?
Yeah, I think it wasn't bad at all, but they were hindered slightly by so much of the presentations being generated from Number 10, and some pretty crappy graphs, and they went up too fast and things like that. So they got better because there were some proper statisticians got embedded in Number 10 and to help them. But there were some awful presentations there again, it was people who really were sort of spads and comms people who were just after making an impression rather than genuinely trying to inform people. Because I think actually because they just didn't understand, they don't understand it. Producing good statistical graphics, when you do them, everyone nods their heads and says, "Oh, that's obvious," and it's really difficult. Really difficult.
I remember a piece you wrote in the Guardian just after the what I referred to as the nightmare on Downing Street, the justification of the second lockdown. I think you were slightly kind when you described that famous SPI-M chart as a mess. I think that was one of the worst, wasn't
it? I still get angry. It should never have been presented. It was leaked, and then they were, that was bad enough. But then to include it in the briefing pack. This ridiculous graph that was had been out of date for ages. It's just one speculative model that, and then everyone's picked on that as, "Oh, isn't this awful modelling?" I mean, I think there has to be a problem with the modelling, and certainly the way it's presented, which I think those could have been much better presented to people if they'd made clear. I mean, the usual thing is that you don't leave the explanations to little print underneath. If there's an important caveat, you put it in big print on the graph. It's inseparable from the graphic. And those graphics they were worst case scenarios based on, pessimistic assumptions. And that should have been in huge print, assuming that people don't change their behavior, simply like that. Because people do change their behavior. And so almost always what happened was not as bad as the graphs, because the graphs were pessimistic. They were asked to produce pessimistic scenarios. That's what they were told to do, because planning is supposed to be based around a reasonable worst case scenario. So that's what they produced. So that should have been an enormous print right across the graphic. So it's inseparable from the numbers. Not just, and so they say, "Oh, these are projections, not predictions." Well, nobody because they're projections based on actually assumptions that we know aren't going to be the case. Which of course you may ask, "Well, why are you doing it?" And I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. But it did show there's some really poor communication of complex outputs there, which just led to misunderstanding and. I think skepticism about it. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about the models myself. I'm not a model. I don't do any of that stuff. So I think some of that skepticism was fairly justified.
When you appeared on Desert Island Discs in early 2022, you told Lauren Laverne that you were overly optimistic about COVID, that you didn't take it seriously enough. Why did you say that? Could you unpack that a bit for us?
Oh, I'm just based on my personality. I'm hopeless. I was thinking, "Oh, it'll be all right. It'll be all right." As the water, rises above my upper lip, I'll still be saying, "Oh, it'll be fine. It'll be fine." So this is just my bad personality. So I got an element of insight, reflexivity there. It shows that you should not trust my judgment. I'm really glad I wasn't a government advisor. So, that crucial period of mid-March when stuff was going up exponentially and we should have, done everything earlier. I was thinking, well, it'll be fine. And actually, although I knew exactly what's happening, I knew what was going to happen because I've been following Italy very closely, listening to their podcasts. We were 2 weeks behind Italy, almost to the dot. What was going to go on. We knew exactly what was going to happen. Italy had, almost turned the corner by the time we intervened. And the interesting thing is that we know, and we knew it pretty well within a few weeks, that cases were falling before lockdown. People voted with their feet before they actually had to, before the formal lockdown rules. So cases were falling before that, because everyone did change their behaviour so much. Of course, what that says about what actually needs to be made legal and what is actually, more a Swedish model of encouraging people to behave appropriately, I think is a reasonable thing to debate. We had to change behaviour. How much of that had to be actually mandated, and how much could have been left up to people's funds is I think a reasonable thing still to talk about. But we had to change behaviour. We had to have the effect of a lockdown. Whether it had to be, quote, a lockdown, the legal thing is another matter. So, sorry, I lost my track now. Optimism. Me, optimistic. Yes. So nobody should ever listen to me and my advice. But I do have that insight, so I keep my gob shut and don't give advice to anybody because I just keep it to myself. And I made, I've got everything I wrote. I got, actually hundreds of pages of notes and things like that for the whole pandemic. And I can look back and say, this is what I thought on March or something. And I made an estimate of how many people would die, my own subjective probability estimate, hopelessly optimistic. So I got on record that I was too optimistic. I thought it was, 20,000 deaths or something like that. But with a distribution, but the distribution wasn't anything like wide enough.
You mentioned a couple of times the importance of trustworthiness in data communication. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What makes somebody trustworthy?
I get obsessed about this. I'm very influenced by a philosopher, Honora O'Neill, Baroness Honora O'Neill, philosopher of Kant. She did the Wreath lectures on trust, which is just the most brilliant thing. I know she says in the end we've got to trust, but a real insight I think that I tell everybody around and everyone's throats is that, I always go and talk in organizations who say, we want to be trusted. So much stuff starts, how can we get people to trust science? Well, actually, no, that's the wrong question. The right question is, how can we be trustworthy? You don't persuade people to trust you. You are trustworthy. You've got to deserve it. That's the number one. You might want to demonstrate that, and then maybe people might offer up their trust. But the number one thing is to deserve the damn thing, to be trustworthy. And so, Honora O'Neill says, trust someone if they're, honest, competent, or reliable. So you've got some basic like that. But those are the basic sort of characteristics of being trustworthy. But trustworthy communication we have worked on, and I think spent a lot of time discussing, trying to boil it down to about 5 points. And the ones that we really hammer and have had some impact, starting to have more impact now, which is really nice. So I'll come on to that. We wrote a paper in Nature, a little discussion piece in Nature. And the number one says that, but usually it involves trying to inform people rather than trying to persuade them. So you are trying to inform them, empower them to make better decisions, rather than telling them, trying to push them into thinking or doing something. Now, we get picked up on that because you might think, well, hang on, if a volcano is about to erupt and you want to get Mount St. Helens or Vesuvius or something like that, you actually think you'd quite like to persuade people to get out of the way. But even then, I think you inform, sorry, this volcano, you're going to die unless you move. That's information. That's not persuasion. So there are situations where you might really want to try to persuade people. But on the whole, in circumstances that I deal with, you actually are trying to inform people, whether it's making a medical decision or a policy decision or something like that. Or you're informing people about why a particular policy has been made, like, the way the vaccine's been rolled out. You actually genuinely explain why you've made that, why that decision's been made. So the other thing, so that's informing and not persuading. And then that means being balanced, talking about the positives and the negatives, the winners, the losers, the benefits and harms of everything, both sides of the argument. Doesn't mean they're equal. One might hugely outweigh the other, but you give the whole discourse. You You talk about your uncertainty, what you know and don't know. And the other one, the one that I feel important about is to actually talk about the quality of the evidence as well. Just, how, which is related to the uncertainty, but it's much more a feeling, well, you know, what is the confidence in your conclusion, what you're thinking? Is this based on good quality evidence, or is this putting our fingers up in the air? And it's something that throughout science and policy and everything, it would be so much more valuable. And people are doing this more and more, talking about what is the quality of the underlying evidence behind what I'm saying. And the other thing which we've added on is that part of being trustworthy is actually trying to preempt misunderstandings and try to prevent the spread of misinformation. And so it's quite valid when you're trustworthy to preempt stuff and say, do you know this? It doesn't, what I'm saying, the evidence does not say this. And people might go around claiming this, and that would be misleading. And I think preempting misunderstanding, you can get into trouble with that because people say, "Oh, well, don't even mention it. Don't even mention this." And it's a bit of an argument there, but I think it is actually better to mention it in order to try to head it off. It's called pre-bunking. It's seen to be quite an effective strategy. You give people the power, empower them to spot misinformation in advance before they even hear it.
I adore the term pre-bunking. I haven't heard it before. Talking, very good, very good. Talking about kind of trustworthiness in science communication, I'm a long-term fan and supporter of Sense About Science, as I know you are, and we've had Tracy Brown recently on the podcast. Am I right in thinking that are you the chair of the judges of the John Maddox Prize?
No, not at all. No, I'm not involved in that one at all. But I'm a huge supporter of them. I saw Tracy last night. It's very nice. So a great organisation, and they push for evidence all the time. So we're just part of sort of. I feel part of this nice ecology of different people. There's Full Fact, it's about Science Media Centre, all these little organisations doing slightly different aspects, and the Winton's stuff, and just me personally, and a lot of other statisticians who get up there and talk. All part of this business of trying to improve the way in which evidence is used and discussed and communicated. And that's it. Statisticians sometimes get called evidence policemen, which I think is a bit too negative. But there is a lot of that. You realise in my career, I've spent decades tearing apart argument, whether it's scientific papers or newspaper articles, tearing them apart in order to criticise them. I always say that critiquing a scientific study should be a competitive sport. I reckon I could do it in about a minute and completely destroy it. So,
you've talked with great eloquence there about trustworthy communications in terms of combining narrative and numbers, stories and statistics. Are there other tools and techniques that you would recommend for if people are looking to become more impactful data storytellers?
This is where I feel I'm an amateur. I'm a doer. I don't really study. I do write. So I try to write popular books that include constantly using stories. The one I've just finished has got full of stories from my own experience or from other people's that trying to use them to illustrate points. Because I know I'm a sort of, I try to be a storyteller because I absorb things through stories as well. That's what we do as humans. So the crucial thing though is to try to make that story trustworthy. But the other thing is, here's a good quote which I use: "There's no point in being trustworthy if you're dull, because no one's going to listen." So it's being vivid and engaging. The one thing I think it is valid to persuade somebody to do is to take notice, to be interested in something that affects them. So I think it's completely valid to be persuasive in your engagement, trying to get people engaged. But then you should try to make sure that your narrative is not pushing them emotionally towards one view or another. Now, that's a real skill. Except you want to keep them engaged, you want to keep them reading, but you don't necessarily want to be saying, "Oh, isn't this an awful thing? We should be doing X." No. You don't immediately draw some consequence rule, because that's what really pisses me off in so much, I know people writing articles and even some scientific papers. You've got a narrative sort of fact, and then at the end of it they say, "Therefore we should have this policy." I think, no. Who are you to say that? Sod off. Don't tell them what to say. Don't make this judgment. That's not your job. Your job is to present the evidence. It's not to say, therefore, what should be done. And when scientists turn into advocates, it really annoys me, as you can tell. Really annoys me. It's a complete misuse of their position.
I like that quote about there's no point being trustworthy if you're dull, and your point before about trustworthiness, that one needs to deserve it. It's like, if a comedian comes on stage and says, "I'm funny," that's not really going to work. You need to demonstrate
exactly.
That
it's not either it's not either persuading the audience to laugh, although I suppose that is. It's actually being funny. That's what you should try to do.
If you were creating a school curriculum for data literacy and effective communication with data, what trust and story and kind of provocation, are there areas that you might include for people to learn?
Graphics are terribly important. I mean, because they're stories, and again, you got to make sure the graphic isn't pushing a particular narrative very strongly. I know I do it. My bacon sandwich story, in a way, is trying to minimize. It serves to minimize the risks, and I think, well, that's not right. I don't want to just do that, because I don't eat much bacon. Because I don't think it is a good thing to eat a lot of processed meat. I know it increases the risk of cancer, and not by a huge amount, but I still don't want to do it. So I'd be upset if, and I know I have been upset when people say, "Oh, that's beyond." He says, "Oh, it's fine to eat as much bacon as you want." No, I didn't say that at all. Just get it in perspective. So again, you can tell a very good, I think, a good graphic tells a very good story, and particularly, I mean, animations can do it quite well, but I quite like just when I'm giving talks, just having a reveal that you can build up story, just a few pictures, build it up, and then click, and on comes the image that tells that someone, and everyone thinks, well, that's really good. Then they laugh or whatever, and it hits them. So, and again, that to have that narrative structure where you build it up something and then do a reveal of the conclusion works very well to provide an impact and engage people. I said, you've got to be careful that they don't take the wrong lesson from it. But those are all the tricks that I use, and that I think that people could learn. Data, a lot of it is proportional reasoning in data, which is standard stuff in education, schools education anyway. Try to get kids to do proportional reasoning, to know the difference between 20 percentage points and a 20% increase, and to be able to handle both reasonably well is a major part of numeracy and education, and a huge amount. And that's, I mean, it's generic across everything, but it particularly holds on risk. And so, usually getting ideas of absolute and relative risk. So, what is, out of how, absolute risk is just out of 100 people, how many will this happen to? And relative risk is taking this thing doubles your risk of getting cancer. And you should be able to handle both of those quite happily and move between them and to see how you can visualize those. And just that skill, I think, gives you extraordinary insights into the stories that were told.
You've expressed some anger and some ire about the misuse of statistics. So I'd like you to point the finger, if you would, David, at perhaps one example from nothing to do with COVID, and maybe one example from the pandemic years of the worst examples of the misuse of data that you've seen in public life, or indeed in academic life, wherever you may have seen it.
Well, I can. Oh God, no! I can. I guess it's only ones that I get annoyed at. Yeah, I. Okay, let's be honest. Yeah, I quite like, alcohol. I drink alcohol. I hope not vast amounts, but I do like it. It's always been, it's part of the thing, and I get very grumpy, and again, this is purely subjective, of course, my own perspective. People who wag a finger and say, "Oh, this is so," people who exaggerate the potential harms of low quantities of alcohol. And there was a huge review done a few years ago, which produced massive headlines saying, no alcohol is good for you. Every bit of alcohol is harmful. There are headlines all around the world. Everything is the Lancet paper saying, and it basically showed that they fitted all this data and showed that from zero alcohol going up, it was just a steady harm going upwards as even with at low doses. And they put out a press release saying, "Oh, this shows that any amount of alcohol is harmful," and this and got huge publicity. Anyway, two things. One thing that was obvious at the time is that the effects of low amounts of alcohol was absolutely minuscule in terms of its absolute risks. I worked out, 26,000 people would have to drink 16 bottles of gin a year to get one extra adverse event. And I worked out, bottles of gin, it was from here to 50 miles of gin, you'd have to be drunk to get this one extra adverse event. So what they were talking about was something that was totally negligible. And it wasn't even statistically significant, so they weren't even sure, it's just chance. So that was that. But then 2 years later, the same group published a paper which totally reversed their findings. They had a J-shaped curve. So small amounts of alcohol were beneficial. No coverage whatsoever. No apology for having promoted a totally wrong thing, or at least I don't actually believe the second paper, because it's just big group puts lots of numbers together essentially. So I thought that was completely disgraceful. And that initial paper and their findings is always brought out and quoted in all sorts of campaigns about alcohol and things like this. And it was wrong at the time, and it's been the same group have actually, reversed it without a single word of apology.
And an example from COVID, other than the Cummings lockdown Halloween chart.
Yes, that was pretty awful. Oh, what was the really bad COVID ones? There were some pretty ghastly graphs on log scales without not making clear whether it was log or linear scales, but it was lots of wiggly lines, spaghetti just going up a page. There was a lot of, there's sort of just people not doing it very well, a bit like that. And then there's people deliberately quoting misleading figures and making misleading, or just getting it wrong. Of course, there's a lot of that people just got the numbers wrong. Oh God, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't really like picking on all the bad ones. It gives them too much. Gives them the credit.
No need to stoke that ire. Let's just a couple more questions if we can. I wanted to ask you how you feel about the sudden widespread availability of AI tools and what they can do for data and statistics and coding. Does it make you feel optimistic, pessimistic, excited, terrified, some combination of the two?
Mixture. Really interesting. I use ChatGPT and Claude. Claude I find is better for my coding. Can't always solve it. I was struggling to solve my problems yesterday, but it did its best, and I use it for coding. I use it for research. I find Claude is excellent, really useful, except it doesn't know what it doesn't know, because the point is that they don't know their own uncertainty, so they're untrustworthy. So they break the rules of trustworthy communication because they cannot communicate their uncertainty. So they're fundamentally untrustworthy, except they can be really good, but you don't know what's good and what's right and what's wrong. So, yeah. So they're great. They're fantastic. Now, what I haven't done yet, and I really should do this, is look at, I've seen some of them demonstrated, but I haven't done it myself, is use some of the automatic data analysis stuff in GPT-4. And that looks really interesting. And actually, I think it could be extremely beneficial. It could improve the level of statistical analysis if that they can put guardrails into these systems. They've got lots in about violence and sexism and racism and things like that. There's lots of what I want is guardrails about doing too many significance tests, or drawing causation arguments from correlated data and things like that. So the system is incapable of getting things wrong. I know that would be impossible because you could always prompt it to do something terrible, like you always can these things, but something that actually it could improve by actually automatic generating caveats or warnings. It could actually be beneficial. Now, whether it's going to do that or not, whether it's just going to churn out a whole lot of exaggerated claims is another matter. But in principle, it could be actually a very good thing. It could raise the level of statistical analysis, because I think a lot of statistical analysis, in fact, is fairly automated. Just like I think that I spent my career critiquing, as I said, scientific papers and studies. For goodness sake, AI should be doing that. I shouldn't have to do that. I should just be able to put a paper in and it tells me what's wrong with it. Why do I have to do it? And I'd want to go and check it afterwards. But it should be able to detect, and I haven't tried it, but I feel I should. I reckon Claude could do it. They're making causal claims from data from which you cannot derive causation. There are unmeasured confounders here that could be affecting the result. This result is they're making claims about the importance of this result, and yet it's actually really tiny, and so on. So a decent bit of AI should be able to do this.
Let's just move outside the statistical lab and AI for a second. I just wanted, because you give them such high store on your personal webpage, and talk about loop and winter wipeout. Did you? And I know from having spoken to you and having listened to you being interviewed by the people that there's a kind of great sense of fun. But did you in your life and kind of wanting to experience different things? But did you use your statistical nous to claim the Loop World Championship in terms of where the balls were going to go?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it's a loop. It's this elliptical table with a pocket at one focus, and so a little dot at the other focus. And the mathematics of ellipse, it says that if you draw a line through one focus, it bounces off the cushion and it hits the other focus. So that's the property of an ellipse, is that, so if you can, in principle, if you can knock a ball over the dot, the second focus, the one without the hole, the dot, and it goes over that, it should then go into the pocket. So you've got this, in a way, automatic guidance as to how to do a rebound pocket of any ball. You can also, unlike a normal billiard table, hit the ball in order to escape from, essentially a block, a snooker, hit the ball right round the edge and it comes back again. It's a really nice, you hit it in the complete opposite direction of where you want it to go, and it just rolls around the table and comes back, which is really clever. So it was Alex Bellow said this one table made. There's only one table I think exists in the world. And it was at some festival in Cornwall, and he was saying, let's have a knockout competition. So, I'll have a go at that. And I have played some snooker in my misspent youth. I used to play quite a lot of snooker and billiards, but I could basically hit it, and it went roughly where I wanted it to. But the other thing was just thinking about where to hit it, and so I was using these extra tricks, mathematical tricks, especially the one of bouncing off the cushion into the into the pocket by hitting it over the second focus. So that was good. So I won.
Very good. Congratulations. Never to be contested again. And how about dodging giant red balls as Professor?
Yeah, the Winter Wiper. It's this obstacle course in Argentina where they fly you up to Buenos Aires and you dodge this big balls and fall in the water and everything like that. Yeah. No, I study. I use this in schools talks because you've got to plan for these things. So I downloaded all the times off Wikipedia and got them all plotted out and everything like that, and looked at I wanted to get through the first 20 of you start and 12 go through to the next round, and I wanted to go to the next round. That's all I wanted to do, is go through the next day into the next round. So that's all I want to be in top 12. So I thought, I'm not going to be in the top. So I looked at the 12th fastest time over all the previous episodes, and that was pretty close to 3 minutes normally. You could fit a regression line. So I fitted a regression line through that. 3 minutes. So I trained. I did 3 minutes. I trained hard. I took it serious. I trained, but only in 3 minute bursts. So I did 3 minute intense activity. There's no point. If you're taking more than 3 minutes, you might as well just give up. You're going to end up sobbing in the mud. So all I did was, and I really trained to do 3 minute intense activity, and it worked. Yeah. Well, 7th, which I thought was quite good.
Very good. Now, of course, I've got a Columbo question. Is there any way that you work or have worked with data that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you? Anything that you'd like to add to our discussion?
Oh, yeah, I suppose. Okay, I mean, they're just pretty separate from the communication part. Although not necessarily. My other interest is, I've got quite a lot of experience of, is working on high-profile investigations, public inquiries. So essentially what went on, investigative, forensic statistics. in forensic statistics is fascinating. What actually happened? So, I worked on the Bristol babies inquiry. I worked on the Harold Shipman inquiry. I worked on the infected blood inquiry. We just finished with a huge amount of work on that. How many people got HIV and hepatitis C because of getting infected blood in the 70s and 80s in the UK, and so on. I'm also giving evidence to the Letby inquiry. So it's sort of, although I'm not doing anything for the COVID inquiry, which I'm just keeping well out of that. In a way, I should. I feel I've done my bit on COVID, so can't be bothered. But I have this interest in forensics and the use of statistics in court cases, legal cases. Also, I got quite a lot of interest in, and in a sense, it's all what I would call epistemic uncertainty. It's not uncertainty about the future; it's uncertainty about what happened, what has happened, what's gone on, causal stuff. In my book, I talk quite a lot about the contribution of statisticians to the mystery of the sinking of the MV Derbyshire, which is this massive container ship, twice the size of the Titanic. 1980, it just disappeared. Just no trace, no distress call, nothing, just disappeared. And they didn't find it for another 14 years. And but a lot of statisticians using extreme value theory, working out what could have happened. And it was a perfect storm. They reckon that, it got hit by a 20-meter high wave, absolutely, because they did they did experiments, scale models on wave tanks and things like that. And that would have been sufficient to crush the forward hold on the boat. And it just went down like a stone and then exploded as it sank. So extraordinary, real forensic investigative use of stats, which I think I'm kind of quite interested in that.
That joins a dot very nicely with a recent previous guest, Professor Angela Gallup, the forensic scientist, and the first book that she wrote after of course, like you, she hasn't retired. She just carries on working. But her book, When the Dogs Don't Bark, it's perfectly good to look where the dogs do bark, because that's where something's going on. But it's when the dogs don't bark that we really need to pay attention.
I use that all the time in my line of work. My forensic stuff on it's always, what am I not being told? And it's one of the most difficult things to teach or learn, because you've got to sniff it to know what isn't there, what haven't they told me, what is missing. Easy to take apart what is published, what's written down. Much more difficult to work out what isn't there.
Perfect. A perfect place to stop. Finally, David, where can our listeners, our viewers, find out about what you're up to online in social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I don't use Twitter. I use Twitter. I follow. I'm more sort of silent on Twitter now. So and I got a web page which I haven't updated for a bit, so I've got to do that. But I got I think I might get back to doing it. I'm so pretty exhausted after COVID. But I might go back. I used to write Medium blogs quite a lot, and I enjoyed doing that. I think I'm going to go back, once I got this book out of the way, I'm going to go back to just writing articles about stuff that's interesting. I'd like to go back. I really like doing that. And I want to try to start doing that again. No, not COVID things, just stats in the news, and stuff where you need to, slightly pull apart what people are claiming.
Thank you so much for your time, David. I think if there were more people with your approach to using data smarter, there would be rather less malarkey in the world of data and statistics, and rather more data-driven common sense. Professor David Spiegelhalter, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for letting me just ramble on.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.